that come on automatically? Oh, that. Okay, great. So, yeah, if you're interested, talk to me at the camp or talk to me this weekend or right after this. I was the Aqua U instructor this summer, 6-week in-person program. I'm not sure when they're doing it next, but maybe in the summer. So yeah, if you're interested, talk to me at the camp. So this is a session, there's an expression in Drupal called there's a module for that. So this is there's a module for that, don't use it. Or I have an alternative title for the Drupal 8 version of this presentation. Drupal 8, there's not a module for that, you don't need it. We have the maintainer created the Drupal module upgrade thing, so hopefully there will be more modules, contrib modules. So how many people here have Drupals, are totally new to Drupal? Anybody? Yes, this is not, yes, it's sort of like a non-beginner talk, I guess. How many people are coders? Okay, how many people are not coders? Okay. All right. So, and the other alternative is there's a module for that. Think about whether you need it. So I'm not saying, obviously, I use contrib modules. We're all going to use contrib modules, or we'd probably be using some other system besides Drupal. Disclaimer, this is not meant to offend people, this session, especially contrib developers. I'm a contrib developer. People who code, people who don't code, people who says they're module for that, and people who say no custom code, or people who give a thumbs up. Simply trying to just have a discussion about why we do some of the things we do. So disclaimer over, let's start. And this is also oriented towards a discussion kind of session, so feel free to stop me, ask questions. My slides, usually the plan is they don't take up the whole hour. They maybe take up, if we don't do a lot of discussions during the slides, maybe they take up half and then we talk, afterwards. But in general, it's kind of to start a discussion. I have my opinion. My opinion changes on these matters. I'm sure you guys have your opinion. So, you have a problem. You would like to show your nodes differently sometimes. So Drupal has a solution. It's called View Modes in Drupal 7. You can check those and have different displays per. So if you haven't seen this, is on the Manage Display page. This is what Drupal core gives you in Drupal 7. Thanks Drupal, that's awesome. It's awesome that we can show it multiple ways. But you'd like more. You would like a featured way to show your nodes. So there's a module for that, Entity View Modes. This is the configuration. So thanks Drupal for that. So let's make a view mode. You go to the configuration, go to Systems, Entity View Mode, add a new view mode, label it feature, export to features, add it to git commit, git promote on live, you do git pull, and then you're done, right? So the UI makes it very easy for you. Or does it really make it that easy for you? This is what you'd have to do if you were custom coding to make a new view mode. So to compare that, we have the top 7 steps above, and then if you were coding it, you have 6 lines of code, and then you git add, git commit, push, live, git pull. So we're basically talking about 6 lines of code versus about 500 lines of code. Great code, right? I'm not dogging that module. I use that module. But it is a, it's a trade-off we're looking at. So, and then you have features, right? Everybody loves features in Drupal 7. It never has any problems. So I'm not saying you won't use features, but a lot of times the less I have to depend on features, the better, as long as I'm still putting stuff into code. I'm not saying don't put stuff into code and don't use version control. But in Drupal 7, features is kind of like an awesome necessary evil. Like it's great that it does what it does, but so why so much code for this solution? So contrib modules give you a lot of value. They give you flexibility, extra features, and a user interface. But you don't always need those extra features that it gives you. You're not always using the flexibility that a contrib module gives you. And then it's not always the case that you actually need a user interface, and we'll see why that one use case where you actually don't need an interface to do very similar things. So, but contrib modules do have obviously a cost of complexity and performance on your site, and bugs. Contrib modules have bugs. So, for example, you have a problem. You would like to override the title tag per node. There's a module for that, the page title module. So, thanks, contrib. I can't see the animations on my little screen. Okay. So, but what about the cost? So, this is where if I had a cup of coffee I would drink, and I'd walk over there and I'd wait for this to be done. So I can't see the. So this is the code to change the title per node. This is the page title, and I actually think this is only one of the files. Is it done? It's not done yet. Okay, so we have around 900 lines of code. So why is there so much code? Flexibility, extra features, and the UI interface. Page title implements a lot of hooks. These actually are not all the hooks. If you're familiar with hooks, basically anytime you save a node, page title has an opinion about that. It's not always going to do anything, but it's always going to be called, and it will decide whether it wants to do anything. So you have that cost of complexity and performance and bugs. But page title has a lot of features. Token integration, granular control, token patterns for content type, page suffix, views integration, term support, and those are just the ones like I found. But what was your particular problem? You wanted to override the title per node. So you could do it this way. Basically what I'm doing here is I'm saying, if there's a field called field page title on your node, then, and this is a pre-processed hook for HTML, so if you have that field on the node, then take the value of that field and output it in your head title with the site name. So I'm not sure how many lines, like 5 or 6 lines of code. So all the code you run, whether you write it or not, obviously has performance hits and potential bugs. So we have a balancing act that Drupal, at least my experience with Drupal, is sort of a constant balancing act between contrib modules and custom code. So custom code is the solution to all our problems, right? No, not exactly. There are obviously major dangers. Custom code has costs. Obviously, the first big one is you own it. You maintain it. You have to write it. You have to upgrade it. So those are not small costs, depending on what you want to do. My personal opinion, if it's 5 lines of code, that is not, those costs become less. I also, in my opinion, it really depends on the team you have on how high a cost that is. Custom code has benefits. It's easy for some stuff. It's stable for some stuff, and my caveat here for it being stable is the 2 hooks that I was implementing for the view modes and for the, what was the last example? The page title. Those are both core hooks, and so for Drupal 7, there's very little change. There's very little possibility they are going to change from the day Drupal 7 came out till the day Drupal 7 dies. Some 3 or 4 years from now, whenever Drupal 9 comes out. It's not always the case if you're implementing a hook that comes from a contrib module. Obviously, that is a lot less stable. So I would, it's a caveat on whether what you're integrating with custom code is going to be stable or not. It's simpler, or it can be. So in certain use cases, writing simple code is simpler than using a contrib module. This is probably the biggest benefit to me, is that you actually you hopefully understand what you just wrote. But oftentimes with a contrib module, you don't really understand what it's doing behind the scenes. If you're a coder, you could dig in there and you could figure out, but if you had to figure out all the code for all the contrib modules you use, it would probably take the benefit away from using any contrib modules. And of course, this is probably a matter of opinion. It's fun. Like for me, it's fun writing code. So for most sorts of mine, I probably have at least one custom module. The most common hook is hook form alter, or hook form ID is alter. Usually for really small things, to avoid installing complicated modules. My example for the entity view modes, why I initially looked at what it was doing and decided to write my own custom code, was because entity view modes, at least it used to export all the settings that it made to one variable, which means it's really hard to split it up into multiple features if you wanted a view mode for, say, user in one feature and node in another one. So I could have write a features hook to change that, perhaps, but then I'm writing custom code anyways. So this is an example of basically to say you have to have the permission edit any article if you want to edit the field location. So this is Drupal 7 code. So what this gets me is the access to field edit based on existing permission. If I wanted it to be on my own permission, I would have to add 5 lines of code. It avoids field permissions module, which is 600 lines of code, no per bundles permissions, meaning that field permissions is a great module, but I found out that if you actually need permissions on a field instance, like a particular field as it's attached to like an article versus if you're reusing fields, it won't do that for you. So in this case, it is not only a choice between writing custom code or using the module actually just didn't do what I wanted to do. I looked at the module issue queue, and again, I wouldn't say, okay, it doesn't do what I want to do, just scrap the module. I looked at the issue queue, there was an issue queue for that. There was a lot of debate of whether it's a good idea to add that. The maintainer decided it wasn't a good idea. I could see where he was coming from, but it didn't work for my case, so 5 lines of code. So yay, but we have a problem. It's hard-coded, right? It's not reusable. I would have to write that code for each site. And old sites wouldn't give the improvements, so there's not going to be an upgrade to, I don't have a field permissions module that I'm going to upgrade on other sites. So this is hard-coded. This is the example from before. My entity view modes example was also hard-coded. But what if it wasn't hard-coded? What if you didn't own it? What if it was configurable? What if it was reusable? So I'm introducing the idea of minimalist Drupal modules. And this is, I'm doing code examples from D7, but this is, an sort of version independent idea, because it's more just an idea rather than the particular code. So the small modules. So this is minimalist field permissions. So basically this is the code to say, for any particular field, in this case only works with nodes, but in Drupal 8 it would be a lot easier to make it for any entity. It's configurable based on existing permission, whether you should have access to a individual field on a form. This is minimalist entity view modes. It's configurable, and this basically adds view modes to different entity types in D7. So you can add view modes to users, to nodes, to terms, to entity forms, to any commerce entities. So I'm saying this is configurable, right? But it just showed you a bunch of code. So is it really configurable? There's no UI, right? But we have to remember that configurable does not equal it has a UI. In Drupal, that's kind of synonymous. Like, it's configurable if it has a UI. But in the larger web development community, that's not the case. So if it's configurable, how do I configure it? So one example of something you could use is you could use this line in your settings.php that says, hey, if there's a settings comp file, include that file. And in your settings comp file, for my field permissions example, this would be the code to say, for articles, for the field location, you have to have the edit your own article permission to edit this field. So the idea here is that not everybody's going to have this permission. And I think I actually meant to put edit any, which would be a larger permission. So somebody who has edit any, we're going to have access to this particular field. If you don't have that, then you don't get access to this particular field. Obviously, that's sort of site dependent. You could easily do hook permissions and make your own permissions and do it differently than this. This is the configuration for entity view modes. So this is basically adding, you would put this in site conf, and you would get a featured view mode on nodes, and you would get monthly view mode on user. So you want to have a little view mode for user of the month or whatever to use that, and you'll probably use it in the view. So every time you would add another one of these minimalist modules, you would have one config file, you'd add it to Git, and there's no need for features, but you're still going to use features. This is just, if you use this type of code, you could get away from features for some of your use cases. So another example would be, any questions so far? We're pretty far in the slides, we don't have that many more. This is an example of, I've made a module called entity, or minimalist GMap, and what it does basically is just say, if you enter some text, I'm going to turn it into a Google map. It doesn't do views integration, all that kind of stuff, which you might, obviously want a contrib module for. But this is all of the code for it. It basically implements a theme, hook theme. It implements hook form, field formatter, and then it implements hook field formatter view. And it basically just passes this along to, in Drupal 7, a TPL file. And the configuration is simply this, a line that says, here is my Google Maps key. And you now all have my Google Maps key. So, but basically, very simple configuration. With the caveat that in that TPL file, you would decide however you wanted to have it. I would have a TPL file that came with the module, but then you would take it and put it in your own theme, and you change it, change the width, you put a class on it yourself. It wouldn't have the ability that you have in most field formatters to say, okay, this is the exact size I want. But you're usually editing TPL files anyways. So this file would give you code it's hard-coded, but it is reusable. Basically, you would take one of these minimalist modules, use it over and over again, and only have to change the configuration file. It's still simple, and you could maybe this is a method for maybe reusing something inside an organization. I sort of wonder if I said, okay, minimalist entity view modes, if I put that out as a possible Drupal 7 module and put it in the module, what is the module application process, what would people say? Like use entity view modes, or field permissions would be use field permissions. I personally could do it because I was grandfathered in. But so I think in Drupal we have this idea where all modules should have a UI because that's what Drupal is, right? Drupal is the ability to make sites through the UI. I don't think that it has to be that. So you could potentially reuse this as a contrib module, but really it's not what we consider the Drupal way. I don't know if that's a good reason to do something just because it's the Drupal way or not. A lot of other systems would do something more similar to have configuration in a file, and very few systems would give the UI, or very few web development systems give somebody the kind of UI that Drupal gives them. But what if you're not a coder? How can you take advantage of this? So my question would be, is this coding? Is this really coding? If all you had to do was make a config file, which really you have to do for settings.php anyways for the database, I don't really consider that coding. To write the other part is obviously coding, but I have this out on Drupal. Question?
It would look a lot less like coding if it was just a YAML file.
Yeah, so for D8, it would probably be a YAML file, right? I mean, technically you could do it in, so I was talking to somebody earlier today, so I was preparing my slides to update stuff to Drupal 8, but I ended up just talking to people about this presentation, and they suggested to just have YAML files, say for Drupal 8, and then part of your build process is you import those YAML files as part of your build process.
Not hard to parse YAML even in Drupal 7.
Yeah, but Drush would actually do that for you. Just say Drush, import a single configuration. At least for Drupal 8, but yeah, for Drupal 7, it's not hard. But no, I'm really not a coder. What could I do? So other advice I have for avoidance for non-coders is, one, frankly, is client request pushback. So one thing I have, and I'm guilty of this myself, is a client would come and ask me, hey, how much does it cost to add this Twitter integration? And I say, hey, you know, what you asked me for, there's a module, right? So it probably takes me 2 hours to add the module, maybe 1 hour. So what's the cost to the client if I'm charging $50 an hour? What's that? $100. That is not the cost to the client. The cost to the client is $100 plus the complexity it adds to the system, right? So I think I've been guilty in the past of telling my clients how much it's going to cost to install the module and configure it, not the cost to them over time. The potential for bugs, other things and stuff like that. The other really common case for avoiding modules is to reuse common modules, right? Views, rules, panels. You know, these are really complex modules, which, but they can be reused again and again for different purposes. So that's actually most of the slides I had. We're about halfway through. Thoughts on this? Yep.
If not a UI, I was thinking in terms of management of your minimalist modules, having some documentation, dependency information.
Yeah, I actually do have an example of this. So in the actual minimalist modules, say I think one of these is the best document enough to check which one it is. I think it's the view modes. Right, so I have this hook here, and I could put this in the README, but I just put it in the hook here, and so there's documentation for like basically how would you, or maybe it is in the README, the documentation for, you know, my suggestion for how you would do it and the documentation for the array structure. But technically, since what I'm doing is actually just reading, this is just a recommendation, because I'm just reading a variable, it really doesn't matter how it gets in there. This is the way I would recommend to do it. But if they had other ways to do it,
Yeah, you could export that variable to features.
What's that?
I said you could export it to features. Is that what
Yeah, you could put it in feature, but again, like features is getting you nothing there, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to comment that one of the things you were saying is that using contrib adds the problem of bugs. But if you write your own, you have not gotten rid of the problem of bugs.
But you have
You're responsible.
But you have a lot less code.
You do have less code, but I'm just saying.
But yeah.
I just want to kind of
Yeah.
put out there that
Yeah.
it doesn't mean you don't have bugs. It means
Yeah.
there is less code, but you're responsible for the bugs, for security,
Yeah.
for updating. You know, this bugs are so
Yeah.
bad, but it's a way.
Yeah, but
It's a way of bugs.
yeah, but also like if you take the minimalist thing where you have code, and I have I think the minimalist view mode up on Drupal.org. Again, that is a contrib module, even though it's not like a traditional contrib module. So potentially, you're taking on the bugs in the sense that it's at this point not a well-used contrib module, but the UI is not the part that makes it contrib.
No, yes, I
Um,
agree with that. I'm just saying
yeah.
that,
Yeah.
that the sort of the contrib
Yeah.
versus custom,
Yeah.
you have the issue of bugs on both.
Yeah.
In the contrib,
Yeah.
it's you and a whole bunch of other people who
Yeah.
are responsible for bugs.
Yeah.
And when you do custom,
Yeah.
it's you.
And I think it also depends like the type of stuff you're doing. If you're implementing a hook that just returns an array, so there's tons of stuff you can do in Drupal by either just returning an array or slightly altering an array. So that is, so I think it's one of the considerations when you write your custom code, like what kind of custom code are you writing? And is it stuff that actually has logic to it? That kind of stuff is a lot more likely to actually have bugs than something where, you know, I'm implementing a particular hook in Drupal and I'm returning an array. Like the very simple example of, let's see, the very first example of the entity view modes where I'm just saying, here's a view mode for a node, it's called featured. There's like, once you do that once, unless Drupal core changes, there's really very like, you know, minimal chance there'd ever be a bug with that. But like, how do you know that, right? You know that by being, I think, by knowing Drupal anyways.
Well, and for example, you know, for this, there's various things that I know are issues you have to be aware of
Yeah.
when you're coding.
Yeah.
In Drupal, like, is this something that needs to go through transit? I don't know if this does.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's kind of my point. I don't know if this does.
Yeah,
or not.
yeah.
Does it need to go through transit?
Yeah.
Does it need to go through sometimes sanitation?
Yeah.
The things you do
Yeah.
need to know
Yeah,
sufficient to be able to make sure that what you're doing
yeah.
is not creating more problems.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of like, what's your team like?
You have to balance.
Yeah, and what's your team like? It's definitely like a confidence.
Can
Yeah.
you kind of extrapolate on that? Because if you understand a particular piece of the core,
Yeah.
and for example, it only gets displayed,
Uh-huh.
then the most dire consequence of that is going to be maybe the user sees something that's misrepresented.
Yeah, yeah,
On the other hand, if it's say you've got a form and you're collecting data, and
Yeah.
for some reason you want to store it as a long instead of a short,
Mhm.
okay, because you have some need for a bigger code or something.
yeah,
And it turns out that some other thing in the bowels of the core expects to see a short. When it gets along, it goes boom. Or it doesn't go boom, maybe it just acts really weird and somewhere down the line it goes boom.
Oh, where you're actually like changing the data type as it goes in, like the PHP data type?
Yeah, that's kind of an obvious
Yeah,
example.
yeah.
But there may be other ones.
Yeah.
Do you have any like other kind of rules of thumb to avoid kind of going where angels fear to tread?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, don't mess with Drupal's data as it goes in, unless that's something you have to be really confident to know what you're doing. And especially in Drupal 8, you have a little less, if you're using there is an entity validation system in Drupal 8, which is separated out from the form system, so that maybe will at least let you know quicker if you're going to hit bugs. But I would say it's also like again, like you said, a display, if it's a display issue. So it's this sort of range of the kind of stuff you're doing. So displaying something that you would not like to be displayed, but it's not a security issue, would be like the very low risk, right? The changing data on the way in for something that's really important would be on the high end of risk. So, I mean, if I was, if you came to this presentation like, yeah, I'm going to write a little more custom code for Drupal, I would, try to think of like, what am I affecting? And if it goes wrong, what am I at risk? So if it's more just a display issue and it's not a security issue and it's a sort of site annoyance if it goes wrong, I feel like that's less of an issue.
So one of the things is touching on is that we haven't mentioned is the complexity involved in adding testing to this process. Because what we people are talking about is how do I know if my code works?
Yeah.
Which means you do that. So all the things that you've shown us are like so compact that I would literally debug them by inspection. I would never run a unit test for them.
Yeah.
And that makes the whole time investment that I have like really, really minimal. That as soon as it becomes large enough, I feel like, ooh, maybe I want to like write real tests for them.
Yeah.
That really increases the amount of work you have to put into it. And so I think this is a similar issue.
Once you get into like if statements and any conditional, any loops.
Where you're really caring about the security, you just want to
Yeah.
validate
Yeah.
the security code.
Yeah.
And so it's a result from this code,
Yeah.
like, I don't have to write unit test for this, or like
Yeah.
now I hate the way we're not doing
Yeah.
it. And it's something
But yeah, I think that the main point of that is to not update that code. Once it's in there, that function does its job. That's
Yeah.
it. So once you do it once,
Yeah.
ideally doing like all the unit testing and everything, it's not like required because that will continue to work on a Drupal code. It's like
Yeah.
everything. But that's like a cool
Yeah.
issue there. So yeah.
I mean, one thing that I wish Drupal did more of, and some modules do this pattern of, I wish I could use entity view modes without the UI part, but you can't, right? It's built in, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, obviously that's a bad example because it's in Drupal 8 and core, so there's no need to worry about it anymore. But some modules like views, do separate out the UI, but that's a case where I can't manually make the configuration anyways because it's so complex. But really, entity view modes is really just a UI around a core configuration that's already there. That's something that could already be returned by a UI. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, now I inherited a site and it has a lot of modules and I'd like to cut that down if feasible.
Yeah.
What are good strategies for identifying modules that are amenable to this method?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I kind of think, part of what I would do, I'm not getting issues with the monitor, is almost, look through your modules and find out not necessarily which ones you can remove because of the nature of what they do, but find modules that almost have no usage, that if you inherited a site and there's something that, there's 5 people using it and you happen to be one of them, that would be a case of, regardless of what it does, will it be easier not to remove it, that would be a candidate for removal just because I would have probably not installed that module in the first place, right? And definitely like dev modules, if you're using dev modules. So, that would be a way to identify modules that then you would say, okay, figure out like what are they doing, and then think about taking them out. But yeah, it's hard to make general rules about that. But I would definitely say there's actually a session on selecting modules later on, either today or tomorrow. Like it's called READ. I forget what the acronym's for, but basically, he's talking about a sort of criteria for selecting modules, and you could take something like that and just apply it to, I already have this site, let me look through my modules. Would I have installed it in the first place? If I really, really would not have installed it, maybe it's worth the effort to either hire somebody or figure out some way to how can I get rid of this module, especially if you have like 200 something.
What about taking a module that seems bloated from your application perspective?
Yeah.
And just editing it down to like, not quite the mini you've got, but something that's approaching that.
I think if you're not editing it down to like 10 lines returning an array and there's still like a lot of logic in it, then it's all your logic, right? Then it's all like, so a lot of the examples that I'm saying is just either very simply just returning an array or very simply just editing an existing array. But if you're saying, well, this module is a bunch of stuff, I need very little of it, but I still need some of the logic that it has. Yeah, I might do that if the module was, say, abandoned or the module was just like really buggy. But as just a, like, I want to reduce complexity and I can make a simpler version of this module. Now you have a simpler version of the module that's still probably somewhat complex that now you completely own, right? Because also if you tried to say, okay, I'm going to have a simple, and there have been a few cases of this. There are like, what is it? There's like Gmap and then simple Gmap or whatever out on Contrib. But mostly, if you take a module and pare it down, you probably completely own it, and nobody else would probably be interested in saying, yeah, let's maintain this module too.
So you could fork it?
Yeah, you could, but then you own it, right?
Yes, to the degree that you have to make sure that
Yeah.
the main branch is changed, you have to reflect. But you're going to kind of do that anyway.
Yeah, but if you pare it down, but you still want a lot of the functionality.
Well, no, I'm saying you really want.
Oh yeah, you really, really want to pare it down. Yeah, if it's something that's, it's hard to delve in, but if you sort of learn how Drupal works and you really like, okay, so how I got the example for this, I don't know why my monitor's not working. How I got the example for the page title one was I looked at what page title ultimately was just implementing this one pre-process hook and then calling their logic, which called all this really, really complex stuff. But what actually changed the title was like 5 lines of code in their case anyways. So if my use case for like how the title needs to change is super, super simple, then that might be a case where, yeah, I would, now I would risk taking that on myself.
That's an example, though, where page title is one of these things that is important in search engines and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
And being able to target whatever's showing up on that page and having it show up on the page title
Yeah.
is important. So, would you?
You mean as far as like the risk to get it wrong is big?
No, the need to customize the page title on each node can be high.
Yeah, so my example with the code is basically say, I have a field attached to my node, I'm going to say what the title is, and I put it in there.
Do you think it's reasonable in the little custom thing
Yeah.
to do token replacements and stuff like that? Or at that point you go back?
Yeah, I think at that point when you're really starting to say, you know, I need all this stuff that page title does. I mean, yeah, the problem, I think the major problem with one of the major problems, there are problems with what I'm suggesting, is that you start to re-add everything back, right? You're like, I don't need it, but yeah, maybe I need this part, and then maybe I need this part. I think, like you said, page title might be a bad example because I would see that, yeah, you could add that, you could easily add that back. I would say for view modes, that's less likely to happen, that you need to add that back, because view modes ultimately doesn't, what it does is great, but there's not a lot of complexity. There's no tokens involved. The UI is pretty simple. But yeah, so it is a case of definitely the problem of potentially just starting to add all that stuff back that you thought you didn't need or whatever. But I have the opposite example of I used the workbench module, workbench moderation, and I thought it was going to be great, and it provides a lot of hooks for you know, affecting the moderation process as it goes through. And then, you know, after the site was about to be launched, I looked at like how much I was using their hooks, and I was like, I just made my own moderation system, you know. So I probably could have had less code if I had just sort of made a field for moderation state and took all this custom code that I was using their hooks for and just put it on like the save and update ones. Because either way, I'm having a lot of custom code. It's just, where's my integration? Is my integration with Workbench Moderation, or is my integration with Core in that case? So I think there's the danger of simplifying a module down to what you think all you're going to need, then re-adding stuff back, and now you own it. Versus there's also the danger of taking a contrib module that has a bunch of hooks, and you really like the fact that it has a bunch of hooks, and allows you to add a bunch of custom code. And then now, how much of the original functionality of that module are you actually using anymore? And that was my problem with Workbench Moderation, was that I'd used it on a few sites and they were great, but I didn't understand the complexity of the moderation system that I was implementing. And if I had to restart it, I probably wouldn't have used moderation at all, because there was so much of my custom code in there, and Workbench Moderation was sort of almost like just a way to call my custom code. And that's what Drupal is anyways, it's a way to call code. You know, it's an extendable system.
Yeah, actually, Workbench moderation is kind of a pain point for me because there's conflicts with other modules.
Yeah.
There's known conflicts with other
Yeah.
modules that are not
Yeah.
getting fixed.
Yeah.
And at the same time, though, as far as I know, we're not doing custom things for Workbench moderation. Is Workbench moderation a good candidate in general for replacement with custom code, or is it specific to your situation that you had a lot of custom code anyway? So
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would say it's a good candidate to see if you really need what it's doing, and if there's maybe a better way to do it. If you need what it's doing, I would say no, it's not a good case for custom code, because what it's doing is hard, and it's doing it well. It's just, it changes the way revisions work, basically, in Drupal, and so a lot of other modules to work well with it, like Panelizer and other modules, need to be aware of what Workbench Moderation is doing. But I have seen Workbench Moderation be used where really they're not using the power of it. So in that case, it would be either maybe a case for custom code or for like rules, a simpler system. And that's also a case where I think the client pushback idea comes in. So yes, there is Workbench Moderation. Sorry, with what you want to do and the other modules that we already have installed, it could cause a lot of problems. So not telling your client absolutely I'm not going to do it is like either I'm going to use this module and it is going to take a lot of work, or maybe this is a case of custom code and it's going to cost you a lot of money, right? But yeah.
Are the incompatibility issues there well documented?
For Workbench Moderation? I don't know. I mean, I haven't used it for a while, but I know there were issues with Panelizer, and maybe Panels itself. Does anybody else know?
I don't remember. I mean, I'm following the relevant issues.
Yeah.
But unless there's actual activity, I'm
Yeah.
following so many issues
Yeah.
that I'm not really in track with it. But there are, I believe there are issues between that and field entity, or
Likely.
yes, field entity.
Yeah, so the main thing about workbench moderation that makes it tricky for other modules to work well with it is that Drupal assumes that the highest revision ID is the current revision, and somehow workbench moderation gets around that. That it assumes that the latest revision ID is the published revision, and workbench moderation does some magic to make that not the case. That's my understanding. So basically, if you're messing with a sort of like major assumption of how Drupal works, then other modules that are going to work well are going to need to know about that assumption. And that's a case where, it makes it tricky for other modules to work well if they're messing with things that you're revisioning in that way. I mean, for the stuff that is not being handled by workbench moderation, it doesn't matter, right? So if what you're revisioning is not something that you're using Panelize for, then it doesn't matter probably. Yeah.
But it's tricky when you have systems like a user needs to be able to edit unpublished content that they wrote,
Yeah.
but they can't publish it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
need to have a lot of permissions, but not
Yeah.
too many.
Yeah.
Right, we have that situation, and essentially what we wound up doing is there was this particular content type that used nested field entities, and that one cannot use workbench moderation. So we turned off workbench moderation for that particular content type.
Yeah. But that is a sort of case where, like, to do what more, if you think, well, I want to change how I want to make my own system, that would be an incredibly complex system. Unless what you really, you don't need this sort of backlog. And really what workbench moderation is great for giving you is that forward editing capability to edit past the current published version.
Which we do need.
Which is tricky in Drupal, so anything you make would also have these same problems. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about organizing file structure, packaging for, say you've got half a dozen site-specific things that
Yeah.
you want to do? I mean,
Yeah.
I think one would not want to have 6 different modules all over the module
Yeah.
page for book form alternate.
Yeah, so most of what I do is I have either sites all modules, contrib, custom features, or maybe just contrib custom, because a lot of times my features have custom code in them anyways. So, and it's one of those things where it's really useful, especially because if you wrote some code but you don't remember which module it was, if you have a IDE that lets you search just in a particular directory, you can just search in that custom directory and be like, oh yeah, this is where I did what I did or whatever. So I think, yeah, you should definitely, I do, I put them in that directory. I also usually prefix all the modules with a 3-letter thing for this particular project. So if I was doing the 6 Mile Tech site, it would be SMT _. All my modules would start with that are custom. So I can easily say, well, 1, that there's not a name conflict with another module, and 2, I can just easily look at it. It's like, oh yeah, that's a custom module for this project or whatever. And I usually do that in my features too. But also, because your features modules could potentially have naming conflicts with regular modules if you don't have some sort of prefix. I guess a prefix is not a guarantee that it won't, but 4 or 5 number prefix is probably a pretty good guarantee. Other thoughts? I do have a class for custom module development. It's for Drupal 7. It's not for Drupal 8, if anybody's interested. But I think in general, a lot of people end up, there's this sort of no custom code idea in Drupal that some people follow, which it's not like I don't see the reason for it, but it is, I think any rule where you say no something doing ever is probably something that's not going to work well. And again, I think it's a combination of what you're doing, Does the contrib module just not work? Does it not work well for you? What's your team like? What's your team going to look like in the future? If you feel like, well, this module doesn't do it, and I'm just going to dive in and I'm going to learn Drupal programming to do it, it's like, probably no, that's probably not the way to learn Drupal programming. But if you're already doing a fair amount of like glue code here and there, you're altering forms, you're doing some other stuff, you're a programmer in another realm or whatever, then it might be a case where, okay, start to think about looking at the modules. I mean, one thing is to learn how to code for Drupal is to be able to see if this is the same idea or not, right? Is to be able to like delve into modules, look at them, and be like, what they're doing is insane. I'm either going to find another contrib module, or I could see a much, much simpler way to do this if I don't need a UI, perhaps. I would like in Drupal 8, I would hope, especially with YAML configuration, that more modules will split to the views UI, rules admin kind of thing, where you don't have to have the UI part. And how that's been worked in Drupal 7 realm is really like, you don't have to have it on, so you turn it off for performance sake in production. But I think it would be great if you didn't have to turn it on and you didn't actually need it if the configuration is simple enough to just like, it's just YAML files. So I'm not sure if that's happening in D8 yet, but there's a potential because there is a configuration management system that it might be something that could happen. So for something like views, like that, you need the UI to make views. But for other stuff, it would be nice if you could just say, well, I'm just going to make this, that's just a pretty simple YAML file that you could maybe just either make it or have Drush pull it in or something like that. Or have a Drush function to set it, which would then make a YAML file or something like that. And you have the potential for Composer then to be able to just, or for Drupal console, just ask you how you want to configure this and then make the YAML file for you. Did you have a question?
Yeah, have you ever thought about these trade-offs with respect to modules that integrate additional functionality from outside of Drupal? For example, like, let's say, a jQuery plugin or something?
Yeah, actually, you're like, I feel like I planted you in the audience. We'll talk later. I actually do have a module that let me see if it's on the custom course list. So I have a module that basically I just look for some random jQuery plugin, right? Which usually the pattern in Drupal would be, okay, there's a module for it, and the UI has all this configuration that you do it, but basically it's just affecting a JavaScript call. Let me see if I'm debugging or something. Yeah, I'm probably debugging. Debugger. Anyways, I think one of my examples is, if you look out on Tedbo on Drupal.org, I have this module called what's this back there? Oh, it's called Minimalist. Oh. Minimalist. Where is it? Page title permissions. Minimalist Select Plus. So this is a module that just says if it's an option select, add the select plus class, include the library from the libraries, the chosen library from the live sites all libraries, and then add, I guess, another JavaScript file that it needs, then add the so add a couple JavaScript files that it needs. And then this is basically, will just turn all my selects into something like, let me see here. Trying to get the display back for. It basically just affects all my selects, so I would have like a fancy select for all of my multiple selects on Drupal. Yeah, I don't know what it is. So this is what it would look like if I edit this file. You know, it adds this jQuery that just nicely does this, right? So this is something that would be a lot in a contrib module. You know, it would probably be a couple thousand line contrib module. But if I know the settings that I want, or if I'm want to include the very basics of the settings in a JavaScript file, then I'm probably okay with doing it. So I think, yeah, a lot of these JavaScript things that just pull in a jQuery library, the benefit they're giving you is that you can configure all the settings that that jQuery library exposes in the UI, which is, again, a case, I think, where it's not maybe such a benefit to have in the UI. It's actually probably more difficult to edit it in the UI than, say, for a YAML file, except for the fact that it tells you all the things that are there. But you could read the library that it came from originally, the README, and that will probably tell you the same stuff, and that would be more up to date. So hope nobody's having seizures around that.
Where are your slides
Where do you
on?
find your examples?
So if you just look at Tedbo, if you Google Tedbo and Drupal, which is my username, I'll give you a card. They're on my project page. They're listed under my modules, and I think they all start with minimalist, the ones that are related to that. I have quite a few modules, or a few modules that aren't minimalist, because again, I realize this is not a pattern that works for everybody. All right, thanks.
Are your slides online?
I will have to check, probably, yeah. Thanks.